In Ogden, Utah, on the 22nd of April of the year 1974, a heinous crime took place that sent shockwaves throughout the entire state, if not the nation as a whole. Courtney Naisbitt was a 16-year-old local high school student who was studying to become a pilot. On that fateful day, Courtney was on his way home from flying when he decided to stop in at a local pharmacy in order to pick up some photographs that he was having developed. However, the only available parking spaces were located directly in front of the oddly named hi-fi shop. And so, after inquiring of the owner of the shop for permission to do so, Courtney parked his vehicle there. And after picking up his developed photographs, Courtney, being the nice guy that he was, chose to pop into the hi-fi store in order to thank them for allowing him to park in their lot. However, completely unbeknownst to the oblivious teenager, there were already two very dangerous criminals waiting within that store. Dale Selby and William Andrews were two 19-year-old men who were members of the United States Air Force. On that day, these two men had unlawfully entered the hi-fi shop carrying handguns in an obvious attempt to rob the place. It was nearing 7 p.m., right about closing time, and two employees were inside the store cleaning up in preparation of going home for the night. The employees in question were a 20-year-old man named Stanley Walker and a 19-year-old woman called Michelle Ainsley. The two robbers seized these young employees and dragged them down to the basement of the store. And when the two criminals became aware of Courtney's presence, he too was brought to the basement, where all three of the victims were then bound and held at gunpoint. The two men then commenced with their robbery of the store. A third man was also involved in this scheme. Keith Roberts waited outside in a van for the two criminals to exit the store with the loot and make their getaway. As time passed, however, Stanley Walker's father became aware that his son had failed to return home at his usual time, and so the worried dad drove himself over to the hi-fi store in order to find out what was going on with his son. Unfortunately though, when Orrin Walker entered that store, he too was predictably taken hostage, and so their would-be rescuer became just another captive. Later that same evening, Courtney's mother was also growing concerned over her son's continued absence, and so she too headed down to the shop. Tragically, Carol Naisbitt would become the fifth hostage of the two men taken that night. Unbeknownst to these hostages, their two captors had recently become utterly obsessed and consumed by a film called Magnum Force. Within the plot of this film, a man murders a woman by forcing her to consume drain cleaner. Truly an awful way to go. And these two men were utterly hell-bent on turning fiction into reality. So Dale ordered William to retrieve an item from their vehicle. When Dale returned, he was carrying a bottle concealed within a brown paper bag. Dale then poured the contents of this bottle, a thick bluish liquid, into a cup. He then ordered Stanley's father, Orrin, to take the cup to each hostage in turn and demand that they drink from it. To his credit, however, Orrin refused to comply with this heinous order. This refusal infuriated Dale to the point that he gagged Orrin and hurled him violently to the floor. Dale then proceeded to lie to the remaining hostages, telling them that the drink was only vodka mixed with a few sleeping pills. With help from his partner in crime, Dale then forced all of the hostages into a sitting position on the floor and to drink from this cup against their will. Of course, what was inside of that cup was never vodka and sleeping pills. Instead, it was straight drain cleaner. And as the victims consumed this toxic beverage, the burning began. Almost instantaneously, the flesh around their mouths began to blister and peel. This was followed by the blistering of their tongues and throats, making it quite difficult to even breathe. However, things weren't going as planned. In the film that the two men were obsessed with, the victim died rather quickly, but that certainly wasn't the case here. The hostages were in such agony that they were all screaming at the top of their lungs. In order to silence them and to keep them from vomiting up the deadly liquid they consumed, the two criminals attempted to tape all of their mouths shut. However, the sheer amount of bile and pus that was leaking from the victims' mouths and throats kept the tape from sticking properly. Orrin Walker had been the very last in line to receive his dose of Drano, and after having witnessed the agony that his fellow hostages were now in, he actually managed to avoid consuming much of the foul liquid by spitting it out of the corner of his mouth. Orrin then screamed along with the others in an attempt to fake his own death in order to fool his captors. However, Dale was rather annoyed that it was taking so long for his victims to perish. And so, quite despicably, the man raised his weapon and fired point blank into Carol and Courtney's heads. Orrin was the next victim in Dale's evil sights. Dale fired a single shot that luckily only grazed Orrin. He then turned and murdered Stanley. Following this cold-blooded act, Dale ordered William to leave the room. After his partner's departure, the out-of-control criminal grabbed Michelle and held the gun to her head. Disgustingly, Dale demanded that the terrified woman remove all of her clothes. After she did, Dale then repeatedly assaulted her. When he was finished, he allowed Michelle to go to the restroom as he watched. His next vile act was to seize the terrified and still naked woman and hurl her to the floor next to the slain bodies of his previous victims. Dale then pointed the gun at her face as Michelle begged for her life. However, Dale was unmoved by this, and he proceeded to fire a fatal shot into the terrified woman's head. Unfortunately, just as the two killers were preparing to leave, they noticed that Orrin was still breathing. So Dale climbed on top of the fallen man and wrapped a cord around his neck in an attempt to strangle him and finish the job. However, this morbid task proved to be much more difficult than Dale anticipated. Following this failure, the criminal rolled Orrin over onto his side. The sick and twisted man then picked up a pin and inserted it into Orrin's ear. Dale then proceeded to stomp on this pin over and over again. And not only did this pin end up piercing Orrin's eardrum, it actually ended up traveling all the way through his head before making its exit out the side of his neck. Before leaving, the two men completed their task of robbing the store. The pair ended up coming away with around $24,000 worth of money and equipment. In total, this whole violent episode lasted approximately 2 hours. The bodies of the victims, however, would lay there for almost 3 hours before they were finally discovered. When he didn't return home, Orrin's wife and son flew into a state of panic. After arriving at the store to figure out what was going on, they could hear strange noises emanating from the basement. Subsequently, the authorities were notified. When emergency services arrived at the crime scene, they discovered Stanley and Michelle both dead. Tragically, Michelle had only recently become engaged to be married. Carol Naisbitt, though, was still valiantly battling for her life. But tragically, she would later lose this battle at the local hospital. On the other hand, Courtney somehow managed to survive the gunshot wound to his head. However, he would suffer from both brain damage and memory loss for the rest of his life. And because of this amnesia, he was not able to testify against the despicable men who had done this to him. Orrin also miraculously managed to survive, even after having a pin stomped through his ear. He bravely went on to testify against the suspects, speaking eloquently about watching his own son be shot right in front of him. The day following this robbery gone wrong, an informant contacted the authorities with information concerning the heinous crime. This informant was also in the Air Force, and just happened to be stationed at the same base as the suspects. He informed the authorities of William and Dale's obsession with the old film Magnum Force. He told them that the plot of that movie greatly resembled the actual crime that had taken place. He also overheard the two men discussing plans for a possible robbery. He even recalled that these men stated explicitly that if anyone interfered with this robbery plot of theirs, they would be killed. This information proved to be enough for detectives to travel to the Air Force Base in search of William and Dale. The two men were then subsequently arrested, along with their getaway driver Keith. Within a dumpster near the base, police discovered the discarded possessions of some of the victims. Throughout the trial, it came to light that the two men had been planning this robbery and murder for at least a month. Because of their utter obsession with Magnum Force, they were looking for a way to recreate these murders in real life. And unfortunately, they found it. The police have always maintained that they actually believe several other men were involved with this plot. However, there was only enough evidence to charge the trio. These other possible co-conspirators remain unidentified to this very day. For his role in the crime, although lesser than Dale's, William Andrews rightly received the death penalty. He might not have killed the victims with his own hands, but he was there, and he did nothing to stop Dale's sadistic rampage. Over the years, he appealed his sentence many times. However, on July 30th of the year 1992, William Andrews was executed. For his part, Dale received 3 separate death sentences, one for each of the lives that he stole on that fateful evening. Dale was executed on August 28, 1987 by lethal injection. It's also possible that Dale was responsible for another murder, which took place right after he first joined the Air Force. There's never been enough evidence for the authorities to prove his involvement. Although considering what he did later in life, I think it's pretty safe to say that he was the culprit in that brutal crime as well. Keith Roberts, the getaway driver, ended up serving 13 years in prison before being released in 1987. He passed away in the year 1992. The Hi-Fi murders, as they've come to be known, are some of the most brutal crimes that I've ever covered on this channel. I can't even begin to imagine the amount of suffering that the victims were put through that awful night. Rest in peace.